Welcome to RegenMedGlobal, the podcast, where we bring you the newest breakthroughs in medicine and research to help bring hope in fighting incurable diseases. My name is Cheyenne. Today, we're here to discuss a clinical trial that is using mesenchymal stem cells for the treatment of various chronic and acute conditions. Leading this research and speaking with us about this, we have one of the most published cardiologists in the world, clinical professor of medicine at UCLA and UC Riverside, chairman of Pacific Heart Medical Group, medical director of Heart Stem Institute, a worldwide pioneer in the field of stem cell research. I could go on and on about his accomplishments. We have Professor Dr. Ernst von Schwarz. Doctor, thank you so much for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have you.
Oh, thank you,
Um,
Shane. My pleasure.
of course. Would love to maybe just start off, if you don't mind sharing with us a little bit about your background and kind of just what you do.
Well, I'm a cardiologist, meaning I treat patients with heart disease mainly. And I have been, since decades, of course, involved in basic research as well as clinical research. So in the late 1990s, we started using not stem cells at that point, but we started with uh, animal experiments where we used, for example, embryonic cells. We used rat models, rodent models. We took pregnant rats and took the hearts of the embryos out and isolated the stem cells and the embryonic cells, and then transplanted those cells into recipient animals in which we created heart attacks 4 weeks earlier. And by doing that, we found two major things. Number one was that those cells from donors basically could survive in the recipients, which nobody had shown before, and we could see them after 4 to 6 months. The way it was done was actually a very neat method. We used what we call a fish method, where we stained the Y chromosome from male animals basically, and then we transplanted those in female recipients. And by finding the Y chromosome 6 months later, it had to come from the donors. So it couldn't come from the recipient. So that was a new thing to demonstrate that those cells don't disintegrate or just die off in the recipient after transplant, but they stayed in the recipient. That was number one. Number two was that in addition to having those cells there, the overall function of the heart in those animals after a heart attack improved significantly compared to sham-treated, placebo-treated animals, basically. So we found the cells survive, number one. Number two, they can help to improve damaged tissue, obviously, by improving function. And that, when we published that in 1998, that's created the whole hype of modern stem cell therapy. Because after this, people were just jumping on the idea of stem cells for different conditions, mainly cardiovascular conditions, meaning heart diseases, strokes, and so on, but also then for neurodegenerative diseases like Parkinson's, dementia. And I was basically involved from the get-go in that kind of basic research using stem cells. And from the beginning, we felt like this is something which is has an enormous potential, has a huge future. And I still strongly believe that it is absolutely the future of medicine, because it did allow us to shift from what we did, or what we are still doing every day, what we call reactive medicine, meaning we react to a problem. Someone comes to me after a heart attack, we have to deal with that, to now what we call regenerative medicine, where we not even want to deal just with the damage, but we want to reverse it, we want to repair the damage. And using stem cells, we have the option. And for me, you ask how I came to that, basically, I'm doing that since 20 years, mainly or initially in the basic research lab, but also always in the clinical scenario. And I'm a full-time cardiologist, I'm a heart transplant cardiologist. and I deal with the sickest of the sickest patients who die if they don't get an organ transplant. But there's too many of those who are severely sick, and there's not enough donor organs. So we are forced basically to look to other options in the future, how we can help. Just to give you the numbers, there's like 6.5 million people with heart failure in the United States, but we only perform approximately 2,300 heart transplants. So that's a tiny proportion of patients who can get to this point. The vast majority are just left with medical therapy and end up in hospitals over and over again because we don't have any way to make them much better. With the medications, we try to keep them how they are, but we want to do more than that. We want to make them better. We want to repair the damage.
Wow, that's very promising field. I mean, just with regenerative medicine, especially based with what you just shared with us. Um, can you tell us a little bit about, I mean, just kind of transitioning into the clinical trial that you're the principal investigator for?
One is those large-scale clinical trials, ideally done by multiple academic institutions, testing a drug or a stem cell procedure versus placebo, for example.
Right.
That hardly exists in the stem cell world because there is no funding.
Mm-hmm.
So usually medication drugs trials are funded by the pharmaceutical industry, but in the stem cell world, we don't have pharmaceutical industry interested in something like that. So we don't have that. What we do have is, of course, in large academic institutions, the basic research studies or smaller trials to, and I was involved in several of them at Cedars-Sinai in Los Angeles, for example, using different types of stem cells to be injected in the heart after a heart attack, for example, or in heart failure. And they all show promising results. But what we are doing besides that is what we call often patient-funded studies, where we don't have a sponsor, we don't have anyone who's paying for it. But in contrast to many people who just want to sell you stem cells around the corner, we try to be in a very systematic, scientific manner, try to conduct therapies under controlled conditions and analyze the data. For example, a couple of years ago, when COVID started, we were the first in the world doing a stem cell study in COVID patients. We paid for that out of our pocket, you know.
Mm-hmm.
It was a small study. It was a single center hospital in the US, what we would call a pilot phase. Not many patients, but we treated a group of patients with a standard therapy plus of COVID therapy plus a single intravenous stem cell injection versus another group who just received the standard therapy. And that study was double-blind, so neither the patient nor the investigators knew whether the patient received a placebo or the stem cells, to basically rid all biases in something like that. And then we looked at the outcomes, and these were very sick patients. They were all in the intensive care unit in respiratory failure at the height of COVID. And even though the study was not powered to look for mortality data, we found that more than half of the placebo group patients died, whereas only a very small proportion, less than 10%, in the patients who received a single stem cell injection died.
Wow.
So again, that was not statistically significant because the total number was relatively small. But it was an interesting finding, and it opened the doors, of course, to the ideas, well, what else can stem cell do? And they obviously do have anti-inflammatory characters and potencies. And that contributes then to better healing and less bad outcomes. So, and based on this, of course, we you mentioned that larger study which we're doing. We wrote protocols for different conditions, and it's only conditions which I personally deal with. For example, I don't treat patients with eye diseases because it's not my field. or with cancer, because it's not my field. But we have a study protocol where we treat patients with different forms of cardiovascular diseases, with neurodegenerative diseases, with pulmonary diseases, diabetes, chronic inflammatory diseases like lupus, infectious diseases like HIV, and. So we have a clear protocol with very simple approaches to how to assess and how to follow up with a patient. So, because that's what we need to know. We cannot just rely, as many people do, on anecdotal data. Oh, I treated this patient with back pain with stem cell, he did great. That doesn't mean anything, because we need to have scientific evidence that what we are doing really helps not only one patient, but more patients, and it's better than whatever they are doing. And for that reason, like I said, we have those protocols, even if we treat patients with degenerative skeletal muscle diseases like arthritis in the knee or lower back pain. We collect the data. We have a strict protocol, what type of stem cells we inject, when, how often, and so on, what the dose is, and then what the follow-ups are. By doing so, we have the opportunity really to gather a lot of scientific data. The issue, as you know very well, Shane, is that stem cell therapy is not FDA approved. So I'm not proposing anything which is not widely recommended. I'm just proposing we need to gather more scientific data. And the reason why it's not FDA approved is exactly for that reason, because we don't have enough scientific data. We need larger studies, and we need actually people who are really willing to sponsor larger studies, because it costs a lot of money. If you want to develop a drug from development to manufacturing, that's $100 million. If you want to do stem cell studies, even in a small number, that costs a few $1 million, of course, and nothing is for free, and that's very difficult to conduct if you don't have like an industry lobby. And the funding, of course, from federal institution and so on, that's all limited, So oftentimes the smaller studies are patient funded, meaning patients pay for the treatment, because otherwise, we can't pay for everything out of our pocket, but with enormous results.
Right. So with this study right now, what type of diseases have you guys been coming across that you guys have tried treating with stem cell therapy?
Well, we have a whole tirade of different conditions, like the ones I mentioned. Mainly, since I'm a cardiologist, of course, the main thing for me is cardiovascular diseases. And that starts from a coronary artery disease to heart failure in particular, to strokes, but also a large proportion of patients from actually all over the world come to us for erectile dysfunction. A lot of men, especially. Not only men, by the way, but mainly men, because erectile dysfunction mainly is a vascular disease. It's considered a vascular disease. It's not a hormonal disease, with some exceptions, of course, but in most cases, with increased age, there's a vascular problem, and that leads to erectile dysfunction. And we have published 2 papers in the last year on that, for example, with enormous results. Keep in mind that we cannot cure any diseases using stem cells. But what we have shown so far is that we can improve symptoms. We probably will be able to delay progression of certain progressive chronic diseases like heart failure and others. And now the next step is really to reverse damage and by thus do some improvements, but not a completely cure of a disease. So besides the vascular conditions I just mentioned, the other big group is patients with neurodegenerative issues. For example, in the last 4 weeks, we had a couple of patients, young people actually, with very aggressive forms of either morbus Parkinson's disease, or MS, multiple sclerosis. And these are devastating conditions, conditions of the brain where parts of the brain tissue is damaged or replaced by some proteins. And in the case of MS, for example, we just had a 30-year-old man who was very athletic, very successful, and then from within a few weeks, he couldn't walk, he couldn't stand, very imbalanced, his vision was impaired, he couldn't see well, concentration was impaired, he was diagnosed with several findings in his spine and brain MRI indicated for MS, and there is no curative treatment available. So in that particular case, we treated him with stem cell injections into the brain via the spine. And even within a month, it was just unbelievable to see the functional improvements of that individual who can walk, who's back in the gym actually now. And even the MRI showed not of course, a complete remission of the damages, but even the neurologists couldn't believe their eyes. It said they had never seen that some of those lesions in the brain disappeared. And we have seen that. That's purely anecdotal. I understand what I'm telling you here, but I mean, we have probably treated 5-6 patients just in the last 6 months with MS, and we are collecting our data now over the last years, also to write them up as at least case series and publish them in a scientific journal to show in limited number of patients the potential and the improvements they underwent after stem cell therapies.
Wow, that's amazing, doctor. That's very promising. What does, I mean, with the protocol, is it standard for all the diseases that you guys are doing for the clinical trial, or is it personalized for each patient?
Well, it's standardized per condition basically, but I don't believe in, there's a miracle drug for everything or miracle injection for everything. I don't believe it. I mean, sometimes people come because of hair loss, we inject them with some cellular materials. That's different as if I treat someone with MS into the brain. So of course it's individualized, and the protocols give us the options, of course, to individualize more or less the type of cells or cell materials we use, and the amount and the route of administration and so on. I don't believe one fits all, and there is like one injection, everybody is young and beautiful and healthy. That doesn't exist.
Are there any risks with doing something like this?
Well, there's a lot of risk, of course. And again, I am not a proponent of unapproved therapies. But I mean, I have been in this business now 20 plus years. And I can tell you that there's not only the outside US stem cell medical tourism, it's even within the US, of course. There's a lot of providers who offer stem cell therapy for a lot of money. And there's a couple of issues to consider. Number one is that most really don't have any scientific reputation, and I don't want to blackmail anyone, but I mean, they don't do it in a scientific fashion. They sell stem cells, like a car sells first. The other issue is the source of the cells. And when we started, I mean, there were a few labs available. Now you find on every corner, in every city, a whole bunch of laboratories who want to sell doctor stem cells. And we tested, I would say, probably 90% of them in the US, a couple in Europe, even in Russia. From Moscow we had products, from Israel, Tel Aviv, and other countries, especially Germany. I'm from Germany originally. And I mean, I have to admit that I was absolutely disappointed on the quality I got, and the cleanliness, the hygienic procedures, the adherence to laboratory standards. It didn't matter if it was in South America or in Southern California. It's crap everywhere, to be honest with you. And I'm a member of the International Society of Stem Cell Research, which published some guidelines in 2016, and they were revised twice, lastly 2021, on the manufacturing regulations for research purposes. And that includes, for example, a dedicated donor screening if you use umbilical cord, for example. That includes, of course, the avoidance of contaminations. But I mean, we all who have dealt with stem cell products have seen patients who ended up in hospitals because of sepsis, because of infections, because they were injected with some products which were contaminated with E. coli, with some bacteria from the feces, for example. And that happens all over because many of those labs, they don't have doctors, they don't have physicians, they don't have biochemists, they have bankers, and they have business people who want to make money, and they obviously don't take much care about the requirements to provide clean and safe and high quality products. So it's a wild, wild west out there. The problem is that there is no information really together. If you Google, if you're a potential patient or a doctor, if you Google stem cell therapy, whatever comes out, 99% is pure marketing. It's advertising. There is hardly any scientific data. I mean, that was one of the reasons I wrote the book, which came out a couple of months ago, The Secret World of Stem Cell Therapy, and that's for the consumers to know or to learn what questions to ask. And you ask about the risks. So one of the risks is, of course, you get a low quality product, you pay a lot, but where's your quality control? And you don't have that, especially not outside the US, and oftentimes not even within the US. The next thing is there's theoretically a risk of creating an immune response after stem cell injections because it is considered a blood product. So if you get a blood transfusion, for example, you might have an immune response, which might or might not bother you today. But let's say you get blood products injected now, and in 5 years, for whatever reason, you need a kidney or a heart transplant, then you might be screwed because you have developed so many antibodies that it will be extremely difficult for you to find an appropriate organ. The average selling transplant provider doesn't tell you anything about that because they don't know anything about that. I'm a transplant cardiologist. Like I said, I'm dealing every day with transplant immunosuppressed patients. And we measure what we call HLA class 1 and 2 antibodies, but nobody else does that out there because they are never exposed to that and they don't even think about that. And I gave examples in the book, for example, where I myself, as a fake patient, called some of the stem cell providers in Southern California and asking about the antigenicity and the induction of HLA antibodies. Of course, they had no clue what I was even talking about. Said, oh no, that's all ruled out. Show me. No, nothing is ruled out because you have no clue. So we overcome that and did that in the past, for example, by not using cells, but using intracellular materials without the cell membranes, and then you don't have any immunogenicity. But most people don't do that. The other thing, or the theoretical risk, is of course always what's in the media is whether or not if you inject stem cells, you might make, if someone has underlying cancer, you can make that worse or not. And the books are not closed on that. It seems that it's probably not a big issue, but again, it's something you cannot rule out. The only way to avoid that is again to use acellular material, so not stem cells, but the acellular materials from within the cells. And again, most people don't do that. They might ask their patient, do you have any cancer? So if someone has active cancer, I would not do any stem cell therapies, period, unless I'm an oncologist and I want to treat that particular cancer. There's one indication for stem cells for certain blood cancers. Of course, it's many, many years FDA approved, but that's a complete different ballgame. But in general, if someone has underlying cancer, I would stay away from any stem cell therapies. But sometimes, of course, patient might have underlying cancer and nobody knows about it. Not the patient, not the doctor, nobody else. So you want to always, of course, have the lowest risk and the highest benefit. And for that reason, again, we in all our studies use acellular materials, which have probably a zero risk or a minimal risk compared to the cellular products. But again, that's not in the public domain. People don't know much about it. That's why, again, I wrote it up for the consumers to think about those things and ask the appropriate questions.
Those are really helpful points. Thank you, doctor. Let's say if someone has interest in enrolling in the clinical trial. Can you share with us about kind of like what the cost and stuff like that would look like?
Well, I don't make the cost, so I wouldn't be able to give you that. But again, I mean, I can just refer to the book which I wrote, came out last year. Um, and it gives you the average number what people charge. You know that it starts from if it's PRP, which is like from the patient's own blood. It's not really stem cells, like a cheap form. But people charge like between $1,200 and $2,500 per an injection for something like that, and others charge for stem cells several thousands. You know, depends on the amount, on the indication. I mean, the cells are expensive. The high quality cells are expensive. The preparation is expensive. Of course, you have to pay the technicians and so it's not cheap, and it's not covered, as you know, by any insurance company. But there's a wide variety of what people charge out there, and I get actually every week emails from people who ask them that, oh, I have want to go to Mexico, and they quoted me $50,000 for that and that, and well, I mean, I'm very skeptical about things like that because you have no quality control. You know, you don't know what they are doing, who the people are. They've never published anything in their world in their life on stem cell therapy, but charging a lot of money, and people believe it. You know, it might help. I'm not saying it's not helpful, but I mean, I would be reluctant to advise anyone to go abroad at this point.
Okay. With this clinical trial, how long do you see the duration of it lasting for?
Well, I mean, we have a design for several years because it will just take several years to gather data. So if someone is interested, like I said, I get emails through my website every week, and people are interested. But some of them think, of course, everything is free. Well, it's not, you know. And some think, oh, we can just fly to, let's say, last week I had an inquiry if I can come to Pakistan and inject someone with stem cells for free. Oh, well, of course not. First of all, we can't do it. Secondly, it would be unbelievably expensive. We're not allowed to export anything, of course. It has to be according to our protocols here, of course, locally.
Okay. Now, once you collect all the data, what do you see as the next phase of the studies?
Well, I mean, we are collecting data now as we speak, and we are writing up what we have and try to publish those data in scientific journals. But again, it's small numbers. I mean, it's more case studies, case series. And then the next step for us is that we wrote a couple of protocols for prospective trials. But again, they won't be patient funded, so we need really sponsors. We need institutions who are willing to sponsor those, not investors, but philanthropists, basically, who are willing to put money in, because again, that's the future of medicine.
Why is this clinical trial, would you say, why is it so important? What kind of impact could this have just within the future of medicine?
Well, I mean, if you look in the lay press, so let's say a year, 2 years ago, every day you heard something about stem cells. Okay, so in the last, I would say 6 months, it has shifted from stem cells to anti-aging. It's the same thing, more or less, because stem cells are used for anti-aging. 2 minutes. And now the next step is actually immortality. You know, so people talk about not even living longer, but living forever. You know, that's why I wrote the next book, you know, Secrets of Immortality, which is coming out in August. But the importance you ask about is because we, I think, are able to reverse damages. We are able to some degree, we are able to um, improve quality of life, and we're definitely able to make people live longer using regenerative medicine, including stem cell therapy, very soon.
Right on. That's awesome, doctor. One last question I have. I mean, we talked about the different diseases that are out there, but who would be a good candidate that should enroll in a clinical trial like this?
Well, again, if you go to a large academic institution, they have very strict inclusion exclusion criteria because you can't screw your data, and often the elderly and the sick patients are excluded. We
Mhm.
don't exclude the sickest ones because if there's a chance to improve uh, quality of life, for example, in someone with severe heart failure, then we want to try that, you know. So theoretically, everybody is a candidate, but of course, we also have some exclusion inclusion criteria. Patients have to follow up, for example. Drug addiction is a big no-no because certain drugs like cocaine kill stem cells. So there are certain things, of course, you have to keep in mind. So not everybody is a candidate, but I mean, many are.
Perfect. Doctor, any finishing thoughts that you have?
I wish thousands more, but I have to run.
Of course, Doctor. Thank you so much for your time. It was truly a pleasure.
Thank
I'm definitely going to be reading your books, and
you.
the information that you shared with us is definitely valuable. So, really appreciate your time. Thank you,
Thanks
Doctor.
for having me. All the best.